one of the words that you've probably come across and heard in your church attendance and Bible study, and maybe now even reading the Bible with us, is the word gospel. We have four gospels that start off the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The word gospel means good news. The Greek, remember, the New Testament was written in an ancient language called Koine Greek. The Greek is euangelion, gospel, good news. Mark 1, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1 says, the beginning of the euangelion about Jesus Christ, God's Son. And so we read these four different accounts of the life and the ministry of Jesus. So how do we get four accounts, and why do we have four? What do we do with four stories that are each a little bit different? That's what we're diving into in today's Bible Basics. So there are several theories about how we got to four, but I just want to present to you the most common one. It's called the four-source hypothesis. So most scholars are in agreement that the Gospel of Mark was the first one to be written around the years between 65 to 70 AD. Now remember, the life of Jesus, we think, was about 6 BC or so to 30 AD. And so there's a good 30, 40-year gap in between the life of Jesus and the first gospel being written down, which we still have today. And so we'll get to that in a second, but just how do we get to the four? So the four-source hypothesis says that Mark was the first one to be written, 65 to 70 AD. And after that come Matthew and Luke. These three sort of go together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We call them the synoptic gospels. So why, you ask, are they ordered Matthew, Mark, Luke in my Bible when Mark came first? Well, that was an ancient ordering when they thought that Matthew came first, and today most scholars think that Mark was written first chronologically, and there's some reasons why. Here's what we call the four-source hypothesis. We believe that Mark came first, and then Matthew and Luke both had access to Mark. We think that because they take sometimes just verbatim quotes out of Mark. So once you start reading more of the Gospels, once you get out of the first one, you'll see stories that sound familiar, or maybe even direct quotes. And so that tells us that Matthew and Luke likely had access to Mark. And so if they had access to Mark, then they have expanded in their own way. And so Matthew and Luke also share some things that are not in Mark. So think about this. They both have quotes from Mark, stuff from Mark. Obviously, they had Mark, but they also have other stuff that's not in Mark that they share. So they must have shared a source. We call that source the Q source. Now, there's never been a document uncovered that's been called Q. It's just that we being, I'm not a Bible scholar, but the Bible scholars have been able to do some inferring and saying, okay, well, they have some things that are the same between them. They must have had a source together that Mark didn't have. We'll call it Q. It's an educated guess. And then Matthew has his own stuff. We'll call that the M source. And Luke has his own stuff. We'll call that the L source. So the four sources are Mark, Q, M, and L. And so then the timeline for the synoptics is Mark is, we think, 65 to 70, Matthew and Luke between 80 and 90. And that has to do with some of the events that they foreshadow. We think that's kind of the rough guess. And then John, the fourth gospel, is kind of out on his own. He may or may not have had access to Mark, Matthew, or Luke, but it's pretty clear he came later, 90 to 110. 90 to 110 or so. So a question would be, why weren't they written down earlier, right? If Jesus died around 30 AD, shouldn't somebody have been following him with a pen and paper, just writing everything down? Well, keep in mind that this was an oral culture, right? This is not a culture that wrote things down in the first place. You told because 97% of people were illiterate, and so writing it down wouldn't have done much good. And also remember that Jesus has had said, "I'm coming back soon." If somebody says to you, "I'm coming back soon," you think what? A few hours from now, a few weeks tops? Well, here we are 2,000 years later, and he hasn't yet come back. His definition of soon is a little bit different than the rest of ours. There's a story that's told that Peter, the chief disciple of Jesus, had gone out after Jesus had ascended to heaven, and he's out sharing the story. And Peter had a follower, a right hand man by the name of Mark. And Mark, the story goes, had been pestering Peter. Peter, we got to write this stuff down. We got to write this stuff down. We got to write this stuff down. And Peter was just not interested in doing it. And finally, one day, as Peter was getting older, he gave Mark his blessing to write it down. And this was between the years 65 to 70 or so AD. So that's how we ended up with Mark, we think. And then Matthew and Luke come along and they say, well, I've got some other stuff to add to this. Luke starts out by saying, Luke chapter 1, other people have tried to do this, and I kind of feel like it was discombobulated. I'm gonna set out to create a very good orderly account. So that's what the words he used: orderly account of the life of Jesus. So that's how we end up with those. And so there are 4 stories about the life and ministry of Jesus. And it's important to note they're not exactly biographies, right? Biographies would include more details. We don't know much about Jesus' childhood. Doesn't say anything. We don't know what Jesus looked like. Doesn't say anything. Biographies would, in theory, say things like that. Instead, these 4 books, these 4 gospels, are focused on the proclamation of a message that Christ has died, Christ has risen, and Christ will come again. Which in those days, of course, if he's coming back soon, that's not something you need to write down. You need to proclaim it, right? And so we get these 4 gospels, and if you do some comparisons, I have a big book on my shelf that has it lists the sections of the gospels basically, and it'll compare. Okay, well, this one said this one said that, and the other one said another thing. It's really interesting. You look it up sometime. And anyway, so in these 4 gospels, there are verbatim parallels. There are copies. Mark says exactly these words. Matthew says exactly these words. Then there's some times where there's this minor but interesting kind of divergence where one says something a little bit differently. There's some where there's close parallels in what they're actually saying, but they order the stories differently. There's some where there's sort of substantive parallel in what they're saying, but the actual words they use diverge. Look at the Beatitudes, for example, in Luke and in Matthew. Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Luke says, "Blessed are the poor," which those are 2 very different things, right? And then there's those things that come about where there's just no agreement, no convergence whatsoever. So, for example, the birth narrative, the Christmas story, all come from Matthew and Luke. If we didn't have Matthew and Luke, we wouldn't have Jesus in a manger and Mary and Joseph, because John and Mark don't say anything about it. And so what do we do with this? 4 different stories. Here's a metaphor I like to use. Imagine that you witness a car wreck at a 4-way intersection. This red car hit the yellow car, or the yellow car hit the red car. If you're here in the bottom left corner, this intersection, you're going to have a clear view. And you might say, well, the yellow car, he was on his cell phone, and that's why he ran the red light. If you're up here in the top right corner, you might look down and say, well, I couldn't exactly see past the white car, but I do see that the red car just T-boned him. And if you're down in this corner, down in that corner, your story is going to be the same. The red car and the yellow car hit each other. But those little details are going to be a little bit different, and so the police are going to ask all four of you independently what happened, and they're going to piece together those four stories to get the larger picture. And so there was a guy by the name of Tatian in the first couple hundred years after the life of Jesus. Tatian wrote something called the Diatessaron. And the Diatessaron tried to take these four gospels and just mush them together to create one cohesive story. And the Diatessaron didn't really work because there are times when they don't quite align and you can't really make sense of why one says one and another says something different. And so maybe a better metaphor for us is that of a mosaic. We take some red and some orange and some yellow and some blue and some green and we put a little bit here and a little bit there. We don't mush them together. It's not a melting pot. It's more like a salad that's got some tomatoes and some cucumbers and some lettuce and some onions. And the whole salad or the whole mosaic creates something far better than they would if they were just mushed together. So these are the four gospels. And as you read, it might be kind of difficult to track, well, what's this saying? What's that saying? What's another say? But just know that you're reading a beautiful mosaic about the life of Jesus.